the entire agri-food sector bears the brunt of the climate crisis.
Pour parler d'agriculture et d'Europe à la jeunesse.
Proteste der Landwirte zeigen, wie wichtig der strategische Dialog ist.
La PAC, c'est plus du tiers du budget total de l'Union européenne.
We have to find a new consensus on the future of agriculture.
Welcome back to Food for Europe, episode number 46. In this series, we like to take you across Europe to look at the challenges, complexities and opportunities of Europe's farming and food sector. But in agriculture, policy matters. What happens in Brussels has a lasting impact on lives and livelihoods across the continent and on everything from your grocery bill to your health. It's a subject that arouses passions, perspectives and protests. That's why the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, set up the Strategic Dialogue on the Future of EU Agriculture under an independent chair, Professor Prof Strohschneider. Its brief was to bring a diverse and sometimes discordant group of stakeholders together to protect and promote farming's long-term future, while also driving economic, environmental and social sustainability for a sector that for many people encapsulates the best of Europe. We introduced the Strategic Dialogue in episode 41 back in March, and you can listen to that online. It was an extended interview with Professor Strohschneider, and I'm happy to say he's back with us.
Good afternoon.
Professor, we're talking to you now just after the press conference in which you handed the Strategic Dialogue report to the President of the Commission. You described in that press conference 100 or so meetings with many stakeholders to arrive at a consensus. We last spoke to you earlier in the year when you were in the thick of that process. How are you feeling personally after such an intense period chairing this Strategic Dialogue?
I'm a little bit tired, of course. I'm coming down in a way, but in a feeling very good, I have to say. It was an immense learningful experience that I had, either with regard to the agri-food, agri-environmental context, as well as with regard to the functioning of the Brussels machine of making policies and politics. And from my perspective of a organizational, sociological interest, which I carry with me for a couple of years, this was really fascinating.
What do you think has been the added value, the legacy of the Strategic Dialogue?
In the end, I think it's all about enabling, facilitating, so to say, new coalitions for the farming communities and for the advocacy organizations. The consensus of the Strategic Dialogue, this consensus is an indication of opportunities for building new political advocacy alliances across the former dichotomies, so to say, between farmers and NGOs, between consumer protection and retailers and traders. And the common point is that they are all, and rightly so, convinced that the weight, also the financial weight, of the agri-food systems in our overall economic situation must increase. I mean, it is decreasing over decades and decades. And it's impossible to only think that this would continue eternally.
Now, the protests by farmers across Europe that were going on when we last spoke to you were arguably symptomatic of inadequate farm incomes. In response, the European Commission cut significant amounts of red tape for farmers, especially on environmental compliance. So, to what extent does Europe have to choose between economics and the environment?
What I think it is all about is to get rid of these false dichotomy of economical and environmental aspects. I'm really convinced that this is an ideological dichotomy. Getting rid of this false dichotomy means to functionally integrate environmental aspects and economic aspects on the ground of the individual farm, and that is possible by incentivizing, rewarding and incentivizing contributions of farmers to ecosystem services. And that means making a business out of carbon sequestration, making a sort of business out of preserving water quality, soil quality, biodiversity, and so forth. And the entire final report of the strategic dialogue is on the possibilities, the opportunities, the concrete steps towards such a transition, which leads out of these false dichotomies.
Professor, our previous episode of Food for Europe featured the Librement Agricultural Fair in Belgium, where there were cattle beauty contests to see and plenty of rare breed beef burgers to eat. So to what extent was the strategic dialogue willing and able to confront this controversial issue of animal husbandry and meat eating in Europe?
It is a broad consensus within the strategic dialogue that it is not about livestock farming, yes or no. It is not about meat consumption, yes or no. Nobody is advocating veganism or vegetarianism. Not in the strategic dialogue, I mean. That is not the issue. The issue is the even distribution of livestock across the countries. And you can, of course, take either a regulatory approach that says limit livestock to certain numbers with regard to certain areas, or you take an approach that goes via the demand side. And the demand side connects then the sustainability argument with the public health argument, because we consume too much meat with regard to health reasons.
So, whether it's a question of our diets or our farming systems, change and adaptation appear to be inevitable, and that's certainly the headline that some media will be adopting in the wake of your report. Professor Prof Strohschneider, thanks a lot for coming back on Food for Europe.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Now, if there's one word that lies at the heart of the strategic dialogue, it's sustainability: economic, environmental, and social. Agriculture's impact on the environment is widely acknowledged, and yet farming and food production are in many ways the essence of Europe, socially and culturally. The environmental imperative to have farming systems that pollute less is obvious, but by participating in the strategic dialogue, Greenpeace had to balance its own wish list with the views and demands of many other stakeholders. Marco Contiero from Greenpeace participated in the strategic dialogue, and he joins me now. Marco, welcome.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Marco, what for you was the standout achievement of the strategic dialogue as a process?
Well, clearly the fact that we reached an agreement. I can't say that I was optimistic since the beginning about the capacity of this group to actually get to an agreement and get to an agreement that has content. It could have been a very fluffy set of statements. I'm not saying that there are not fluffy statements. There are also statements which, everyone could have been agreeing since day one. But we went into very concrete discussions, very concrete negotiations on crucial points. And we, as human beings as well, managed to establish a relationship, I'd say, of trust, despite having to defend different interests. So that was really surprising. And we worked a lot. One of the smart choices was to force us to stay for a long time together and discuss in plenaries, in working groups, at dinner, during coffee breaks. That clearly helped confronting ourselves and our positions.
And that constructive approach was common among all participants, was it?
Well, one thing that disappointed me is the fact that some of the stakeholders did not really engage. Either were present but very silent, or were not present at all for the majority of the meetings. And again, if this is a process where it's important to build trust, and it's important to have a confrontation, a frank confrontation about each and every aspect of your ideas and arguments, participation is essential. And I'm not talking about farmers' organizations. They all participated a lot throughout the process.
So what was the motivation of those who, you say, stood in your way, who tried to disrupt the strategic dialogue?
Well, if you're approaching a process of this kind that touches upon many, many delicate issues, you may decide strategically to sabotage the process. And I think that was their aim, probably since the beginning.
That's a pretty heavy word to use. Give us at least an idea of which group or groups took this approach.
No, I think it's, first of all, we're bound to Chatham House rules, and I do want to respect them because of the fact that we've been asked to build trust, and I think it's important.
Where do you think the outcome of the strategic dialogue will break new ground for European food and farming?
I have two examples. The first one is clearly the fact that we all agree that we have to move away from hectare-based direct payments and start providing money to farmers on the basis of their needs and not of their size. And this is a major agreement which I hope will change the future of farming in Europe. And then when we touched upon animal farming, we managed altogether to agree that it's important for the EU to drive a shift in dietary habits with an increase in consumption of plant-based food, and also to address the environmental, climate and health problems caused by animal farming, and all that without imposing all the costs and all the efforts on farmers. We clearly cannot do a transition of that kind by simply pretending that this can be done at the expenses of farming.
And that's a point that Professor Strohschneider made earlier about driving this change in food consumption. Another point he made was about the protests by farmers as the strategic dialogue got underway, that we need to look beyond seeing agriculture as a choice between economics or the environment. But if you can look back for a moment to those protests, don't you think that the Commission's subsequent dilution of some of the environmental compliance requirements for farmers was understandable, given the financial precarity of agriculture for many farmers?
We were very unsatisfied, to say the least, by that decision, mainly because it was a reaction to the protest by farmers, clearly a reaction influenced by the upcoming European elections, and a reaction that did not look at the real root causes behind farmers' hardship. The main problem is that the market is crushing them. Other actors are crushing them. And those real, very serious root causes of their problems were not addressed by killing the environmental aspects of the common agricultural policy.
So what's the way forward now that the European elections are out of the way?
The way forward we all agreed upon is the pot of money, which is pretty significant compared to the rest of the European budget, that is dedicated to the common agricultural policy should go to farmers that need it most. And it should go to environmental measures put in place by farmers beyond respecting existing legislation. This means really driving away from the current system that gives, unfortunately, the money on the base of the land owned or worked. And it ends up paying more for rich landowners than for poor farmers.
Marco Contiero from Greenpeace. Thanks very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much.
Well, you heard there that Marco couldn't fault the engagement and commitment of farmers' groups in the strategic dialogue process. Cogeca, the General Confederation of Agricultural Cooperatives, represents the European agri-food, forestry and fishery cooperatives at EU level. I caught up with Cogeca's relatively new president, Lennart Nilsson, a farmer from Sweden who participated in the strategic dialogue, and I began by asking him about his expectations when it was first announced.
We came from challenging legislative targets in the Farm to Fork and in the Green Deal, discontent from on the ground, and our members feared for the future and had a lot of uncertainties on how to put in place the transition requested by the institutions. So the expectations were high, particularly with the need to reposition agriculture and food as a strategic asset for Europe, and to depolarize the discussions with EU institutions and society.
What surprised you about the way the strategic dialogue unfolded?
Many things. I was just elected president of Cogeca when I got the call to be in Berlamont in a few days just. So I didn't maybe expect that we should have so many meetings. I think we have done in 7 months the work of maybe 4 years. And I definitely don't expect the very strong involvement of all the participants and the engagement and the interest for our work. And that was a positive surprise. I think this showed that we have had a change in approach in how we discuss agricultural matter, and hope we can continue to do this and also to include our members and farmers.
That's an interesting perspective, considering that Marco mentioned to us that he felt some of the participants weren't sufficiently engaged or interested in their own contribution or in the contribution of others. Fundamentally, though, what did your organisation want to achieve through its participation in the strategic dialogue?
Repositioning agriculture as a strategic asset for Europe. And we wanted to bring back food security, competitiveness, income for farmers to the centre of the EU policies. And I'm glad that the strategic dialogue endorsed this message. And I'm glad that also the agri-cooperatives that I represented have a role in strengthening the farmers' position in the value chain and boosting sustainable production and sustainable competitiveness of our sector. So there are things that I think we have achieved. And I think there is important messages in the report. Of course, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to keep a strong and simplified CAP that ensures food security and income. There's also questions about the role of livestock and diets. But we are especially glad for the speech of the President von der Leyen when the dialogue was presented. She said, there is hardly a sector more important to our continent than agriculture.
You mentioned very briefly there the question of livestock farming and diets. This is something that many of your members feel strongly about, even as consumers are being urged to cut back on meat consumption. Are you ready for that?
I think if we consider improvements in how we produce and how we keep our livestock and so on, there will be an acceptance. But of course, the freedom of people to choose are important, and whichever diet you choose, it's important that it's produced in Europe. And I'm quite sure that our farmers and agri-cooperatives can provide what the consumer wants.
Overall, how are you going to take forward the outcome of the strategic dialogue with your members?
In fact, we have been sitting 29 people representing quite different backgrounds. I hope this is a start of a new way in the policy making. I think it's important for us that we reassure our farmers and our cooperatives about the positive outcome, because this is only the beginning of a process. And it's important now that we going in the same direction and to build this vision of the European agriculture, which is in line with both the vision in the strategic dialogue, but also in line with the reality on the ground for our farmers and for our agri-cooperatives.
Lennart Nilsson, there, president of Cogeca. So we've heard from the chair of the strategic dialogue, a representative of Greenpeace, the head of a farmers' cooperative organisation, and now we turn to the food industry, which plays a crucial role in driving economic growth and delivering employment across Europe. Dirk Jacobs is the Director General of Food Drink Europe. Dirk, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Dirk, first, to use a food metaphor, what are your key takeaways from the strategic dialogue?
Well, I think the first observation is that listening to others, we found out that, in fact, we share a lot of similar views on what can be done in terms of changing our practices, in terms of improving sustainability and so forth. So we're actually not that much far apart. And I think the second important point is that we're talking about transition. And transition, by definition, is a process. And we've learned to appreciate that different actors in the chain and in the food system have different speeds of transition, have different needs of transition, and it's therefore crucial to bring all of that together. And I think what was very striking is that we've learned to appreciate that besides an environmental dimension of sustainability, we also have to look at the social and the economic dimension, and connecting that will help to depolarize also some of the discussions, because you all are committed to the same objectives, but also understand that that process needs to be built in with the necessary guarantees, with the necessary mechanisms to make sure that it cushions well with all the actors that are having to do it.
Were there some policy sectors that were not sufficiently well explored for your liking in the strategic dialogue?
I think we have covered a lot of ground, and it's always difficult to cover everything. Perhaps we could have gone a little bit deeper into the innovation piece. And I think we've had a lot of discussion about innovation, but we haven't really gone into the detail on what are the types of innovations and technologies that can really make the biggest impact. So I would have loved to spend more time on that and to see how we can boost public-private collaboration to that end. The same goes for trade. I think we've had quite a lot of discussion about the trade implications, but I think we should also look more at the opportunities that trade bring in the current geopolitical environment. And we can still do this. Our suggestion is to keep up this dialogue and to expand on it in the time to come.
How does the strategic dialogue compare to other forums or engagement processes that you've been involved in previously?
It's indeed an unprecedented exercise, asking stakeholders to start on a blank piece of paper, discussing quite existential questions about the future of agriculture and food, and then basically forcing us to move beyond our established positions and our established views. There was a bit of risk, I think, involved from the side of the European Commission to engage in such a process. But at the same time, it has led to new insights, new ideas, new thoughts, at least from my side, new relations that we've built. So I think this has been a very positive process as a starting point. And I really want to insist that this is a first step. Now we need to translate it into concrete action and further follow-up. If not, this will be one of the many reports that will go into the dustbin or into some sort of drawer inside the Berlaymont.
And so what makes you think that won't happen? Surely there are still some significant gaps that remain in terms of the details.
I think it's fair to say that this report marks already a significant shift from previous top-down approaches, advocating instead for a more collaborative, inclusive, and also market-driven strategy for agriculture and food. So we will have different views about the how, but I think with this report, we have already set out a common path on the what. Let us have the disagreements now and then about the how, but make sure that the narrative remains. And the narrative is that we can all do it, that agriculture and food are strategic, important for society, and has a huge challenge ahead to move towards more sustainable food systems. And that we can only do that together with enabling conditions such as finance, such as innovation, and a better competitiveness of the agri-food chain overall. And if we drive that narrative forward all together, let us then just discuss the little details here and there and disagree on them in public, but move along on that path, I think will make a lot of sense for us all together.
Dirk Jacobs from Food Drink Europe, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be part of this podcast. Thank you.
Dirk Jacobs there from Food Drink Europe. Thanks to him and to our other guests, Lennart Nilsson from Cogeca, Marco Contiero from Greenpeace and, of course, Professor Prof Strohschneider, the independent chair of the Strategic Dialogue, whose stewardship has led the EU towards breaking new ground in securing the future of European farming and food in a sustainable, competitive and socially just manner. But, as we've heard, and to borrow a famous quote from Churchill, the publication of this Strategic Dialogue report is not the end, it's not the beginning of the end, but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. That's all from this edition of Food for Europe. You can catch our growing back catalogue of episodes online on all major podcast platforms and in 3 languages. We look forward to bringing you more news and perspectives on food, farming and rural life in Europe soon. So, until next time.
The entire agri-food sector bears the brunt of the climate crisis.
Pour parler d'agriculture et d'Europe à la jeunesse.
Proteste der Landwirte zeigen, wie wichtig der stratégische Dialog ist. La PAC, c'est plus du tiers du budget total de l'Union européenne.
We have to find a new consensus on the future of agriculture.